Good evening, everyone! Hopefully the sound is working better today than it has been the last couple times I mixed this up in some way. Welcome to another Mish-Mashing Battle Lounge with the 2MK team. And we were going to have mix and match, but today we've decided not to do that. There's no specific reason for that one way or the other. It just seemed more likely, given who was available and the timings it would take, that we would end up doing that way. So, what are we looking for or at today? Mostly we are looking at ways of getting in on people, either people who are playing very aggressively or very defensively. Because most of us are used to the idea that we're going to play around in neutral and look for this opportunity or that opportunity, but particularly lately, because of the way fighting games generally work, players who know how to play other ways tend to rank up too quickly for this to matter. Meaning that, no matter how you slice it, you're always going to be left with a certain tier of player that either only knows how to go all in or run away. And because of this, they don't tend to be as effective or successful. The result is generally this whole big cloud block of people with a particular playstyle. Once again, mostly because people who don't have that playstyle rank up higher. But of course, whether or not you as a player, even if you assume that you don't have the same problem, whether you are above or below that cloud has to do with how well you deal with it. And of course how bad your lag is. We all have different levels of this. The willingness to play quickly, slowly, get different things done or not. And of course our characters contribute a lot to this too. How good your defense is often has to do with how well you can stand up to the characters that constantly attack. And how good your offense is based on how well you deal with characters who constantly try to make space and run away. Both these skill types have to be built up in your play for different reasons. And a lot of them require specific mindsets that have very little to do with your execution. Often, the mindsets required to do the defense one are much bigger in difficulty. Because when you're stressed, the body, as long as you're fairly into the game, your mind and body are going to treat it as if it's something dangerous and scary. You're going to have a lot of those reactions regardless of how you want to play the game. And similarly, you get the impatience ones from the feeling of, I want to catch up to this opponent that is making me frustrated because they're running away. And the same thing happens. But one of them is usually much more of an execution requirement than the other. And recently we've been talking more so about the one that is not the execution requirement. We've been talking about people's ability to keep their cool and get in on an opponent who wants to win by defense, particularly if they want to win by defense by retreating. More importantly, you have to be able to tell when an opponent has switched from one form of this to the other, and A lot of the time, you can only do this once you've realized their skill in getting away from you and how strong their pressure actually is.
Fight.
But it's very hard to understand at the beginning of a fighting game what strong pressure actually looks like, since most of us don't have, again, the physical ability to tech the throw perfectly every time, or to understand the mix-up that's happening, or to even understand the frame trap that's happening. These are things you normally have to learn at least a little bit, or use some special tricks to get out of the situation. One good thing you can do for yourself, though, is to figure out what happens. How much damage does your opponent do to you in a round if you happen to get out of their pressure? You're not really looking for what happens when you are pressured and, oh, you made a mistake. No, don't look for that. What happens when you do get out of their pressure? A lot of the time, we repeatedly say on these streams to watch whether or not your opponent lands any damage on you in neutral, especially without a special. And if they do, was it done because they kept on walking backward and you overcommitted? There, for example, is probably the first damage that Kansuke Dynasty has taken in neutral for the match. And there is the second, but technically that was sort of a mistake on her part. So, you can definitely see her basically defeating herself in certain spaces, but if she walks forward here, the opponent will keep on giving up the space because the way that they've chosen to play neutral usually results in very little damage or no damage. Understanding how to walk into that space and not get clipped matters, but sometimes getting clipped is just fine.
You lose.
The important thing is that if you can get yourself to realize, I'm not taking damage any other way. I'm taking damage when I try too hard to make my stuff happen, or I'm taking tiny bits of damage when my opponent is stopping me from walking in on them. This is an automatic win condition for most people. Now, whether or not you have the physical skill yourself to play footsies in a way that won't cause you to take those hits is a really big deal. If you get too twitchy, if you don't understand what's going on, in some cases, if you do anything other than walk, and Honda's definitely a character like that, you're just going to lose. However, this is a difficult thing for Kansuke Dynasty to do, to just walk and nothing else. Especially since, with a character who is able to cross the screen quickly with an attack, you have to basically block on reaction or have a problem. Like that. Because the other problem most of us have is that if we get into this state, we go, well, fine, I'm just going to walk at you no matter what. And of course we get hit because there's a specific timing where you have to stop walking around the time you'd expect the opponent to no longer be in that state of walking backward. You have to understand basically how long your opponent will retreat before you need to worry about them doing something crazy. Feeling this out is difficult for a lot of people.
You lose.
We generally suggest watching your meter every now and again. This is particularly true when you keep on winning or losing interactions and scrambles.
Let's do this.
Alright, I'm taking damage a little bit, so I need to do something about this. What can either I or you all do about this? Can/should I stop? Because It's not that this matters to me directly or that you need to do anything different or better, but I can't keep on saying the things I'm saying under that scenario. One can get to it. Let me know when I will be able to right now stop with no strength.
The main event! Your show!
Okay, let's rumble.
Round one. Fight! The sky! Power bomb! Yeah! Right hit front!
I'm all warmed up.
Elbow! Black shot! Yeah! Right! Catch! Elbow! Yeah! Headbutt! A serious shot! Sure is a wide world! Round two. Fight! Sumo throw! Sumo throw! Sumo smash!
But for today, let's look at the strength of our Honda player's offense, as that was what we were really discussing before. The ability to control your opponent's mindset with moves like Honda's headbutt is a form of offense even when you're walking away. This is specifically because it offers a threat, an option for the player to use in offense very quickly that, again, most people won't and can't react to in time. Meaning that it is the equivalent of being in your opponent's face from the other side of the screen, and that is a powerful form of offense. You see it here as well. Lots of offense, as has been said by a great teacher, is about getting your opponent to stop blocking. And if you can't get them to stop blocking, getting them to stand still long enough that you can dash up and throw them for blocking. So we're looking today at the incredible effectiveness at which this Honda player can get the team to stop blocking long enough to get hit by his moves. This is not something that is easy to understand because it's not necessarily about just doing the move randomly. There's a specific feeling and timing that's involved here. The neutral jump there, for example, is a strength of Honda that we specifically meant and got into our Honda bot. Depending on your Honda bot, it might not be so great, but it's definitely in there with a strong attempt, and depending on how you've put in action 3, I think it is, you can get some really good neutral jump stuff as well. There, again, there was no specific reason why DeWolf needed to stop blocking, but Honda and this particular player are super good at causing the mindset of, I should do something now, and they're ready to counter it at almost every moment. This is not, however, solved by continuing to block. It is more so solved by facing a point where you have realized, my opponent wants me to stop blocking. My opponent is in at least enough control of this situation that when it looks like I have an opening to do a really obvious thing, to do something at this range that I'm used to doing, they have made this thing a bad idea. They set it up beforehand. And that is a large part of what offense is in any game. The number of layers required to do this well differs by game and by character. But in this case, Honda is a perfect example because he is such a clean and simple character relative to it. He will do approximately the same string every time. What he is good at doing, which comes down to a lot of different characters actually, is that he's good at dodging the move that you want to do, or simply convincing you that he's in range when he's not, or convincing you that he's disadvantaged enough when he isn't. This is a heavy part of Street Fighter in particular, because when you shimmy around, when you push out your opponent with certain pushback strings, the response is often, well, I'm supposed to hit a button here because if I don't, you will do something. And the great part about that in offensive terms is, if you don't hit the button, they also don't have to do anything. Generally, the thing that makes this difficult for the offense player is when they try to play this type of offense and it's forced to turn into long-term defense. Some people have the patience to get all the way through it, but others eventually twitch out. The one walking forward does have a little bit of option. Specifically, you can go for things that you wouldn't expect. You can go for things that are hard to counter in some way, or you can go for specific timings that make the move itself end before the opponent would expect, or other things like that. Another thing that makes this very strong is if the player has a lot of moves that keep on pushing you back. We've often discussed this in terms of Alex. Alex is usually trying to buy himself some space because once he gets cornered, there's more problems. But Honda has a lot of benefits here because he doesn't have to stay in the same space. He does have good knockback in a lot of situations. And he's one of the characters that generally, when you see him walking backward, he makes you cautious instead of going, well fine, you're just going to give me all that space, I'll take it. And therefore, depending on the character, it's difficult to get anything out of it. One thing that normally helps here is presenting the character with a move that is difficult to whiff punish in some way. And especially if that move has pushback that you then have control of. As just demonstrated by Amara, Abigail's Heavy Punch at the correct range is a very good option for this. Heavy Kick also works, but that's more so a thing you use on G than on Honda. Like against. But it's definitely also a good option. A lot of the reason for this is because characters who have this type of move, this headbutting style thing, this crossing screen style thing, those moves are often not as strongly hurt box based as you'd think. Meaning that a lot of the time, you end up trading or even hitting the move out altogether by doing something the player doesn't expect. Anything that can reach them before they expect to be reached, because their reaction time is based on being able to fill a lot of space in front of them and freak you out. It is therefore possible for Abigail's stand Heavy Kick to reach Honda by the time he gets far enough into the animation of the move to have to care. It's usually very important to understand which of your moves are capable of doing this and are not, which is where a lot of advanced stuff about your own hit and hurt boxes comes in. Another good option is any move that's just hard to whiff punish as a generality. By being difficult to whiff punish as a total thing, You add additional stress to the player trying to do it. And simply adding more stress to someone makes it harder for them to play this type of game. Their offense being based on waiting for you to make a mistake, or rather misleading you into thinking that you should do a thing and make an opening for them, is often thrown off by the fact that they don't necessarily know anymore whether or not you are going to somehow quote-unquote fluke out an attack. This is helped even more by the fact that the heavier buttons you can use for these purposes often are completely misleading. This is not a thing for heavy buttons in general. I'm specifically referring to heavy buttons that are in some way difficult to whiff punish. It doesn't always matter if they reach that far, but anything that reaches far and has a difficult whiff punish really helps, because it lets you fill space and gives you something to do for the opponent to have to think about. When using this method, therefore, it's important for the offensive player to remain really calm about a particular aspect of the game. They have to trust that once you have managed to land a hit, once you have managed to get them to mess up and get hit, that you are going to attack them. Because once this happens, if they get frustrated by the scramble, then they really might get opened up. They really might be at a disadvantage. If they don't, though, a lot of the time the positioning that they've set up, or just the tendency of players to go for big attacks soon after doing this, means that they probably have enough defensive options to get away with it. This is one of the things you see most often in the new matchups you get out of people playing against Seth. Seth as a character can rely on this quite a lot because Seth does so much damage and also creates extremely complicated scrambles. Once those scrambles have been triggered, though, if Seth is willing to believe, I can handle this, you're going to attack me now because I've been frustrating you for the last 20 seconds, you're going to try to come in. This is why Seth players, as a generality, will tend to uppercut on their wake up, because usually Seth is one of those characters where once it gets mixed up or messed up, Seth gets at least knocked down. There's a lot of sweep stuff involved, sometimes some long range stuff involved. And no player wants to get a knockdown and then have to, like, not get anything out of it. But you can definitely see here that it works a little better, let's say. You can get a sweep, and then from the sweep something will happen. But there's a lot of stuff involved in that. That feeling of, okay, my turn, and the person who is playing this style, because their entire mindset from the beginning has been in that gotcha sort of state. They're waiting for you to do things and miss. But technically, attacking at the wrong time registers in their mind just as much as a miss.
Sure is a wide world.
Now, why did I call this offense? In Honda's case, you should consider this offense because when Honda is ready to do either that jump or the headbutt, the player on the other side has to basically go, I don't know, can I react to this in time? It's more or less instant by most people's standards, because a lot of what we do in this game has to do with spacing, and anything that continues to cover space until it hits the target offsets this feeling quite a lot. Honda is blessed even further with being like Blanca. It's very difficult to get a good punish out of Honda just doing this move, especially because Honda can use different strengths of headbutt to mislead you even more, or to end up at spacings, like just measure this spacing and do that much. It's not like Nikali where more or less they're all the same and you just have to worry about whether or not you were in range to begin with. Honda is the one that controls whether or not you were in range. And with that level of control, with the ability to back off and yet play it as offense, there's very little that the player can do. Even if you did manage to block it, you'll end up feeling like you didn't achieve anything because you didn't get to punish it. Technically though, the bigger thing you often want to rely on is the fact that if you keep on doing it with the correct timing and spacing, you could also win by, for example, white health, and eventually Honda has to jump or sumo splash. And that therefore is one of the biggest things that we teach with our Honda bot, how to punish those moves, because those ones, while are not always strictly punishable, they are definitely counterable if your mindset is in the right place at the time. This is difficult, of course, because of the feeling that you must close in on a character that can instantly cover the whole screen. And of course, Honda has different sumo splashes. Here they are now. Sumo Splash is not specifically a difficult move to beat in itself, but it does have the same problem. The feeling of, ugh, my opponent did a thing and got away with it, because we really don't like that feeling. This is something we try to teach through Clawbot mostly. Clawbot has specific moves where your options relative to Claw will lead to either you doing some damage or both of you passing each other like ships in the wind and nothing happening. And of course the player on the Claw side can do this forever. They can spend an entire round doing almost only the thing that causes you two to whiff each other and nothing to come out of it. If you know the exact timing and spacing, the exact response, you can avoid being tricked into getting grabbed or getting hit, but you would definitely spend a lot of time flying around with neither of you actually taking any damage. However, it means that your opponent gets to keep on trying to do something that might do damage, meaning that you just have to flinch once and you've basically lost. And you only get to keep on responding with something that will do no damage. A key to, once again, fairly heavy offensive play. From the defender side, therefore, it is often a good idea to move to an unexpected position, but it isn't with the intent of hitting the opponent. You move to the unexpected position so that the opponent's move that they use to avoid having to do anything in particular is then at the wrong range. And you can use this to increase your own defensive capacity quite a lot. In fact, one of the ways we do this most often is to suggest that people backdash in certain situations instead of attempting to finish their approach. Not because the backdash is helping, but because if the opponent has decided to use, say, Sumo Splash when you get to a certain range, and every time they use Sumo Splash it's annoying you, if you backdash out of this space at the moment they're about to do it, you pose no threat. They don't have a thing to defend against. They see a movement and they go for, let's say, a Sumo Splash. But depending on your character, you might be able to punish Sumo Splash after backdashing. While this is not specifically taught relative to moves like Sumo Splash, you can still check out our Kata 30 series. It doesn't actually have a Kata 30 in it, just 31, 32, 33. These are partially meant to teach you how to do this, how to get out of a space and then quickly back into it, or use a long attack on reaction. One of the most important things to train about this is specifically to not watch your opponent while you're, not watch your own character while you're doing it. You backdash, trusting that your character's backdash is the same every time. You don't have to really worry about what's going to happen there. And over time you learn, if I was standing at this spot and I backdash, then I will be here. And then you look and think to yourself, is this space that I'm in now the space that I can hit my opponent from? If the answer is yes, go for your hit. And usually you have years, or rather it will feel like you have years to make your hit. because you didn't spend a lot of time mentally confirming what was happening. Most of the time, this is also no threat to you because if your opponent used an entire special or even a dash, sometimes the worst that will happen is that the move you use gets blocked, which might feel bad, but it's not really different than getting frustrated in neutral and using the move anyway. In other words, if you felt, maybe I should use this move now, it might hit them, then you could probably do the same thing with a backdash version, because neither you nor the opponent may specifically know how close you are to being able to hit. That, for example, was a perfect moment for it. Had the wolf backdashed, I'm almost sure he would have made it out, and almost sure he would have been able to just just dash straight back in and go for a full combo or at least a power bomb. But we are also conditioned to stand our ground, particularly because getting hit with lows sucks, and because we don't tend to think through certain aspects of matchups once frustrated. Here's a good example. Honda's lows all suck. They're terrible. You get sweep, and that's not even good range. So, in this particular matchup, unlike many others in the game that you play, you're never really worried about the opponent getting close to you and clipping you when you backdash with a low or anything like that. He does have some good buttons for the situation, but mostly, Honda catching you out of backdash with a button is one of the least of your worries, meaning that you get a strong option, even if you're not immediately thinking about it. Now, this isn't to say that he doesn't have counters to you backdashing. He definitely has lots of counters to you backdashing, but it means that he must give up the idea of always reacting as if you didn't. You've simply added more situations to his life to deal with. Forward dashing out of sumo splash is basically just as effective. Even when you get hit by it, it's setting up a situation. If your opponent goes, oh, I see you're gonna forward dash my sumo splashes, I'll use my light sumo splash. The problem is that light sumo splash is the most punishable one at the range you would think to forward dash. So, one or two forward dashes, and it becomes a mix-up, a guessing game. Your opponent is playing rock, paper, scissors with you again, as is often the case in these games, because they no longer have the option of going, well, I'll just target where you are, and they can't consistently choose to target where they expect you to be, because their move takes much longer than yours. As in, you could, on reaction, dash against sumo splashes, or you could dash in a lot of situations that would make the opponent think that you were trying to dash under a sumo splash. If this then causes them to change how they use the move, you get an opportunity to hit them for using the version that is hittable. Layering all this on top of your walking can be somewhat difficult, but it's easier when you let go of the idea that you need to hit the opponent in order to get things done. It is often remarked by the team that their own offense usually isn't that great. Bots do have methods of training offense, but usually they are more so supposed to teach you the ranges at which you don't end up taking damage, rather than the psychology behind getting someone else to think it's going to happen. That's a much bigger challenge for yourself. Can you get your opponent to believe that you know what you're doing, or that you don't know what you're doing?
Let's do this. Round one. Fight!
This can be said to have a defensive component, of course, and the defensive component of this style of play is usually making sure that every hit you launch after walking forward toward them, for example, will be blocked correctly, or that you will just whiff entirely. Because 1, making you whiff is frustrating, even if it can't be whiff punished, and 2, when they have moved into that space, especially if they've taken away all of the options at the longest ranges, it generally causes most people to do more risky things that can actually be more easily punished. Adding more stress distracts players from all of their other options, or encourages them to use more of their meter than they strictly need to. However, while I have definitely been saying and still stand by the fact that Honda walking backward with the intention of using the headbutt is a form of offense, there is something to be said for the defensive part, and the defensive part is mostly staying directly out of position of any move you could even think of that would be a good idea to hit. And by good idea I specifically mean you really can't be punished for using this move, at least not heavily, giving you a chance to, you know, let off some steam and actually hit buttons, basically. If they spend too much time at that space, the stress that is built up doesn't get to stay. And there's a lot of stress and tension in that sort of play. Just going, okay, well, I don't ever get to hit anything, and now I have to deal with everything you're going to do forever, is one of the most frustrating things in most fighting games.
Honda wins.
When you play games that have a lot more neutral, specifically games like Koihime, you end up with the same experience, but it's just a slightly different level. You're often faced with a character who will stand at this range, where your buttons can't reach, or don't do much, or don't pose much threat, but theirs do. And while you could say this is footsies, it's not strictly the same thing. Because footsies is usually about moving into spaces with the intention of making your opponent think that they can hit you, and then misleading. This is more so a full defensive tactic. I am not going to be in range of any sensible thing you want to hit, and I'm going to keep this up until you hit something that's not sensible because you're tired of it. Minute changes in this are also really important, because the player can then use the option. Let's say you have a move that you are able to make safe or nearly safe at a certain range, but at, let's say, 1 or 2 steps closer, it won't actually be safe anymore. They'll be completely prepared for that. They'll stand, continually avoid the range at which you could make it safe for a super long time, and then stand almost at that space but a little bit closer. Result, you use the move, it's not safe, and you get hurt. And this of course adds even more frustration. More importantly, a lot of options of particular types get lost in this whole thing. Particularly ones that are physically hard to execute in some way. Every time you push your opponent to a part of a matchup that is difficult to physically do, you've increased their stress even further. Especially if the thing that's physically difficult to do isn't itself foolproof. The terrible feeling of, this is hard, I need to time it perfectly, I need to execute it perfectly, I did it, oh, but my opponent was completely prepared for it this time after all of my effort and defeated it, and now I feel as if I can't do anything at all. This sort of thing drags down most people's willingness to try different things enough that it allows players of this type to simplify matchups. Less crazy stuff is happening because of that skill of theirs of staying in exactly the right spot, where even your good crazy stuff is too hard to consistently do. Abigail has way more good crazy stuff than Karine does. Karine is not a good crazy stuff style of character, but she does have a little bit. Mostly Karine's sweep is under that umbrella, and her stand medium kick in certain matchups when you are in a position where the opponent might otherwise think, okay, you are going to let me walk away now. Because most of the time, they'll position themselves such that the crouch medium kick doesn't work. The stand would, but they expect you to not hit that because the stand medium kick doesn't do enough damage or doesn't convert into anything. And, of course, hitting the stand medium kick is risky, so hitting it and then taking damage for hitting it feels bad. And they're counting on you to not hit it because it feels bad to be wrong about it. Similar things happen with uses of EX Mujin-Kyaku and Light Mujin-Kyaku. These moves are super punishable. They're not ever what most people will consider great ideas, but they have places in certain matchups and in certain mind states.
You lose.
One good example of this is actually based on something that we use, or rather that Kansuke Dynasty uses in the Zangief matchup. The Zangief matchup is heavily dominated by the Light Mujin-Kyaku, not because it's the greatest option and definitely will be safe, but there's a space that they end up at where Zangief doesn't want to try to challenge Marine anyway, and the Light Mujin-Kyaku bothers Zangief at that range even though it's not strictly a great idea. Honda doesn't really suffer the exact same fate from the Light Mujin, but there's still stuff you can get out of it. Specifically because, being a special move, it does collide with certain things, but more importantly, it changes the range. Until you get really used to the range that she ends up at after Light Mujin-Kyaku, you don't necessarily know what's happening. And it's not intended to hit you, you don't know if you should respond or not. It's a whole thing that happens. Adding one additional layer to a matchup, even if it's not the most intelligent one, can sometimes be worth the payment, let's say. Whatever little bit of health damage you take from risking doing this move that could easily be hit, you must take it sometimes just to get your opponent one more level of frustrated, scared, or stressed out. Like that. So you can see here that because they have to now think about not necessarily even dodging that move, but if they decided, well, I need to be able to punish or discourage you from doing that, then they must devote time to reacting to that move. And you know what the worst part about that is? There is a range at which Karine's sweep hits. Instead, they'll be like, okay, well, I know you're coming for this Light Mujin-Kyaku thing, I'm going to be ready for it, and then it gets swept because her sweep is really long. And that's it. it's not really that you've decided, okay, I now understand how this matchup works. No, you just did something to add to your opponent's necessities in terms of how much they have to think. And that alone will push them. That alone will also push them. Because it is by pushing that you get to the moment of, I'm going to Rasenha and then EX Rasenha. Because I know that your mindset is so focused on punishing my mistakes that I can fake mistakes. If I have meter, I can fake mistakes. And if you don't think they're mistakes, if you have experienced that once and have me do the Rasenha, then get EX Rasenha, and you decide that the next time I Rasenha, you're not going to fall for that, then I get free pressure. It might not be free pressure, you still have to guess. You might not be thinking to yourself, okay, free pressure time. You might be thinking, oh, I need to EX Mujin Kyaku again. Sorry, EX Rasenha again. And you'd be wrong and get punished terribly. But if you don't have to take any risks, what was the point? I believe this is Tokido's quote. If you can beat an opponent without taking any risks, you can't possibly be playing at the highest level of the game or matchup. Old games, maybe, but it's just not supposed to feel like that for most players, for most matchups. If you can do it without taking any risks, without doing anything other than playing the best way mechanically, then you are probably not at the highest possible level of the matchup. Because there's going to be someone out there who figures out how to manipulate your concept of the perfect match. Or someone is going to complain that the game needs rebalancing, because it probably does. For Alex, this is relatively easy. Not because Alex has a whole bunch of really good options against everything Honda does. It's easy because Alex can mostly just backdash and forward dash in ways that will make Honda think more about mistakes. If Honda expects, for example, that Alex is going to do elbow, this is easy to deal with. If they expect head crush, easy to deal with. Walk, forward, crouch, medium kick. All of these things are things that the Honda player can go, okay, I know how to deal with that. Backdash, forward dash in certain situations is much harder. But it doesn't lead to any damage, and it is taking a risk and opening yourself up to a bunch of things that Honda does. Should you go for it? It's not really a matter of should you go for it as a generality. It's more so a matter of, can I get anything out of this enough to make my opponent have to think about more stuff? And you can already see it working out at least a little bit. The more back and forth there is in Alex's play, the more Honda has to think about. And you can often tell because their level of focus on certain types of defense is rapidly reduced. Which is good because we were talking about this Honda player's offense and how good it is, and there is also the close range version where they're actually putting on pressure on particular types. There we go, for example. Once Alex is cornered, there's a bit more to it than this because he can still use all those other options. It's not that you were supposed to let go of them. You could still get stuff like this, you could still get head crushes, air knee smashes, all sorts of things. Because those are still options available to you. But they're only available because you've not done them enough to make your opponent think that that's what's coming. On top of that, you get to create scrambles, which often, when a character is too quote-unquote honest, like Honda is, most people don't say he's a very honest character, but for the most part, like, he does things at certain ranges that you don't get to do anything about, but he's not really a character that will confuse you in a scramble. When a scramble happens, it's a good chance that Honda is at disadvantage. because he doesn't have any invincible moves, his armored moves are very dependent on little things.
Round one.
And his moves that have good spacing, lows are, as I mentioned, not so great. You might get a little damage, not a whole lot. There's a lot of things that Honda has to care about. Even getting in close and going, okay, I'll just go for a block string. If the opponent decides, oh well, now I have you in the correct position on the screen, I'm going to use my V-reversal to keep you there instead of doing this. Now you have to care again. This is also what we were mentioning. Being able to dash in and expect that the other player will not be able to deal with it other than to maybe jab you out is still useful because you're not going to die from being jabbed until like the 100th time. I think it's actually the 50th time against most characters. Yes. It takes about 50 jabs on most characters to kill you. For some characters, if you were low health and their jab did 30 damage, it would still take 30 of them. Jab being the light punch. You can afford to take a couple light punches in order to get more psychological stress in a matchup. And this is why playing in certain ways, for example what we mentioned Cosmic Wolf does, is a completely valid push in the game. You just go for it because, yeah, maybe you won't block it the 4th time. Usually this depends a lot on not necessarily your health or health lead, but more accurately, how quickly you can remove the opponents. If your opponent is in 1 touch to kill range and you have 3 touches left, will you give up 2 of them for the chance for that one last touch? You may end up feeling or looking a little silly when you dash in the 3rd time and get poked the 3rd time and lose. But what if you didn't? What if the 3rd dash was the one they didn't react to and you won?
Let's do this.
So, we get to see what Cosmic Wolf does in this situation. This is going to be difficult primarily because this again requires a lot of dashing around. And dashing with Necalli in this matchup is probably your biggest priority. And maybe jumping medium punch or jumping instant medium punch. Because Honda is so effective with Sumo Splash and Headbutt against Necalli as a generality, that fighting normally becomes a non-issue. You basically can't do it. You could try to have the incredible fortitude to hit medium punch and knock Honda out of things, but because characters that use uppercuts are really susceptible to Sumo Splash, it can be easily caused to whiff, and Necalli, despite being particularly good at this, is not really that good in terms of direction. Can't anti-air upwards straight either for the most part. And you can't even be sure that jumping medium punch is going to resolve the problem. So while it does help, it's similar to the other thing. You dash in particular situations because you want to more so discourage your opponent from using the same Sumo Splash every time than because you know it's going to stop this particular Sumo Splash they've just used. Another difficult aspect of this matchup is that most Necalli players are trained to try to get to their V trigger, whereas Honda is a matchup where you basically want to V-reversal your way out of a lot of things. But the things you want to V-reversal your way out of are usually single long hits in neutral, which is not something a lot of people are used to. We're used to thinking, well, pressure is where I do this, but Honda doesn't really do a lot of pressure strings in the straight sense. He sets up throws that are based on either I'm going to throw you without hitting any buttons, I'm going to throw you after one button, I'm going to hit two buttons and make you think I'm going to throw, but mostly just hate the fact that you let me hit two buttons and do something else, probably walk forward and then hit more, or just go straight into hands. Depending on your position on the screen, you then end up having to either V-reversal the hands, which is almost always completely safe to do, or you generally should just stand there and block and not worry about it. And if you happen to get thrown, too bad for you. But Necalli is capable enough of getting to force Honda to play a specific type of neutral that being able to use the V-reversal to keep Honda back and off balance in those moments ends up being useful. See? Two buttons, back off, look for something else. But at the end of the day, defense against this level of offense is stressful. Playing this V trigger does help a bit because the other one Honda will go straight over at least. Here you have a chance of putting something in front of him that he has to care about at least a little bit. Particularly if you use that move and then dash through it, Sumo Splash becomes less of a danger. It isn't that it won't hit you, it's that it trades weirdly sometimes. And depending on what you're trying to do, that might be good enough. But getting to that point is still giving up your V-reversal, giving up control of certain parts of the matchup. Abigail has a similar problem. You're not going to get much chances to use your V-trigger other than cancels, but Honda doesn't really let Abigail hit a lot of buttons that involve getting the cancel, meaning you're spending a lot of time building up a meter that you don't get to use, and your opponent will eventually probably just kill you by some command grab. If you do find the moment, it's good, and in fact, not to be reversaling because you realize or think you don't need to. Oh, here we go, we are now switching to Balrog. But this is going to be about the same, because Balrog fights in almost exactly the same way, with one key difference: no Sumo Splash to think about. The question is either jumping or the twirl into overhead equally effective? In general, the jump from Balrog is almost as effective as Sumo Splash, because you have to also deal with the twirl into the overhead. If you have really, really good overhead defense, it doesn't tend to come up. Which is going to be a bit of a problem for the player who is shifted to Balrog regardless, because Amara generally has way better overhead defense than most people, leading to the ability to do that and lead up to more damage. And the move is not beneficial enough to Balrog for it to work out consistently. But we're still seeing a lot of the same type of mental state. A lot of the same, I'm going to make you think you need to do something, and then do something of my own, or convince you that you shouldn't do anything and then probably jump. And you can't say, well, okay, I'm just going to anti-air, because you really can't just anti-air at that point. Even with massive amounts of training, this will generally not happen, which is why you hear commentators talking about top players choosing good timings for their jumps. The timing they're referring to is kind of hard to understand when you're first watching, because you know, everyone knows it's the same deal. You jump, the opponent does an anti-air. How hard can this be? What is good about this timing? What's good about the timing is that the player has read the moment at which you want to attack with something they can jump over, or have changed your mindset in some way such that you're no longer thinking about them jumping. And this is a skill that builds up over time.
Balrog wins.
More importantly, even if the player is anti-aired, it's not usually enough of a reason for them to never jump, The jump is just in a space in their style. You would have to show them that you could anti-air them every time before they would stop using it, because it's like trying to not use any other aspect of your style. It has a purpose, it's in there for a reason, even if it's not necessarily leading to good damage right now. Sometimes it's leading to very poor damage, or even getting hit, obviously. And sometimes it leads to you getting hit fairly hard. But depending on what other things it's unlocking for you to be able to use because it's stressful on the opponent, it might be entirely worth it. If you have enough damage as a character that just threatening to jump will let your opponent will give you an opening to beat up your opponent in some other way, then keep jumping. Not a lot, not necessarily even often. Sometimes you go a whole round and don't jump, but you constantly put your opponent in the mindset that you might jump, and that's always important. But yes, it absolutely does come up a lot that the overhead is important here. So this matchup is a little harder on Gamer2256 because while they will still land the overhead and sometimes it will be at a nice critical moment, on average it's not going to be as easy as against many other players. Meaning they have to rely more on the jump. And you get the question of, okay, exactly how much control do they have mentally over that part of their style? When I say that, I mean that there's a specific set of people who jump, but because the jump is connected to the hitting of the button, parry characters get them every time. The usual response to this is to just jump more, because again, they're looking for control. They're not really looking to get the jump damage. If they jump more, it becomes more effective, because they could then jump more consciously, jump with the intent of not hitting the button and therefore beating the parry, and hopefully beating out the automatic parry response from the opponent. Which is why we have entire bots for specifically training yourself to, when you realize your opponent has jumped and you flinched and either parried or didn't, a counterable or dodgeable or misleadable anti-air. To recognize, not only will they do this again, but you probably have to reposition. Because getting yourself to not parry is way harder than getting yourself to a different position where their button won't hit, or their empty jump won't do anything. It's super important. Now, training that takes a long time. But even this we do have some stuff for. Which bot you use for it does actually depend on your character, which is a little bit of a loss in terms of our content right now, because your style is also part of this, so we don't generally put up on the site, hey, this is the way to do that, because we don't really know for sure. If you notice that there's a bot that specifically says, hey, play this character type against it, change this button, change this point system, maybe, it can help you a little bit to understand this. And most of those bots do not necessarily have a requirement to use an anti-air on them for points, but definitely jump, and they usually jump at like very seldom or the worst times. It's super important, in fact, to train yourself on bots where jumping is really unlikely and not part of the main system, but they do jump occasionally, Gil being a good example. Fight those bots and watch carefully. If you're trying to do everything else, how often do you actually manage to anti-air?
You lose.
For a few of them, it's important enough that we did make it probably point system D the hardest thing, and that's the exact requirement. The bot spends a massive amount of time doing everything but jumping. You have conditioned yourself for a long time to deal with all of the things that they do.
Round one. Fight.
And then they jump once in a blue moon, And because you usually block it, because the bot is not usually meant to make it all that big a deal, it's difficult to get bots to do proper jumping combos consistently. Most of them have their jumping combos, or some jumping combo, but, you know, it's semi-random. They're not going to offload with big blast into super every time they land a jump. But if you imagine that they did, if every time you fail an anti-air you just let the bot beat you up for 2 seconds, and have to deal with that, you will quickly realize that most of us, when doing enough other things, will not anti-air. And that is what makes it such a powerful part of this type of game plan. Being able to dash in, being able to threaten with meter, all of these things end up forcing you to train for long periods to get through this. So against a player with offense this strong, you're going to get overwhelmed. That's the entire point of all of their training. They have trained for a super long time probably to do all of this. Whether or not this would, so to speak, get them, like if they wanted to rank up or choose to do so, it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to rank up, for the opposite side of the reason I mentioned before. This is not a rank up skill necessarily, because being able to carefully walk out of range of an opponent and then make them miss is exactly the sort of thing that gets you to silver, but it doesn't necessarily get you higher than that, because at the point where you are like that, everyone else who also got those skills is there with you. And then you spend all that time with neither of you wanting to do anything because you don't want to be in range of the other person's move. You can definitely see some matches where people will spend massive amounts of time backing off, sometimes perfectly, sometimes not so perfectly. Sometimes running because they know it will be frustrating enough in the end. Sometimes snatching a life lead and then backdashing for up to 10 seconds at a time. Not necessarily even because they think it will frustrate you, just because it's killing time. But you can watch and learn from the level of skill applied to the jumps in this player's style.
Fight.
And of course to the overhead as well, which technically stopped being used partially, I guess. Maybe because of Amara, but maybe not. It comes up a bit more later though. Because against Alex you needed a lot more, generally. Alex has a lot more options against Balrog by reversal powerbomb, so unless you know for a fact that your opponent finds it difficult to do this, there you go. The overhead has to come at some point. Mainly because Alex needs to hold charge at least to some extent, just to give a threat of something. Fortunately for Balrog, in most timings, with a slight delay, the overhead tends to trade with Alex's stomp and head crush in weird ways, so you don't spend your time thinking, I'm going to get countered constantly. You more so go, well, I'm going to Hail Mary it now and hope that this is one of those times where you react weird. Even that moment just now that you probably not quite missed, but definitely had to not blink in order to see, of walking to the exact range where literally the slash elbow would have fanned Balrog in the face. Just the air from the move would have crossed his nose. So today we thank Gamer2256 for their massive amount of strain exercise, so that everyone can see where they are relative to that. Emotional control is a huge part of these games, and the blitz of many different attack styles is important, because we normally complain about people who want to run away, actually run away. They're not moving to a spot to make you make mistakes, they're not going to block perfectly, they're leaving. And today, we definitely don't have that. We have a player who knows how to stay out of the range of everything. And if you are able to walk them to the corner as a result, it's still not necessarily going to be them running away. They just are just as equally aware that if they move to a perfect space for them to stay out of your range, you're probably not in a situation where they can come in on you. Especially because an advancing player will normally have a bit more leeway there. This style is actually somewhat built around that, because using characters like Boxer and Honda makes it possible to take advantage of that tiny slip gap where you are walking forward. You should be able to react to nearly anything, most dashes for example, but you might not be able to react to those moves.
Round one.
Building up a skill to, for example, hard counter the incoming punch would be phenomenal, but it depends a lot on the hitbox of the move. This is partly why people were always so impressed back in the days when this was a big thing, because arcade players with enough quarters and time on their hands would do things like learn to consistently jab you out of Psycho Crusher. And you can imagine what it's like to have the boss of Street Fighter 2, the supposedly most powerful character, using his supposedly most powerful screen carrying move and being punched. Or in some cases slapped, which is even more like degrading. And this still happens actually, because they've made sure that Psycho Crusher still has this property. You can just jab Bison out of it. Not the super, the new V-skill, V-trigger. There was even a point at which you could, I think, get Boxer's punches to hit such that they were -4 on hit and then punish them. Just let him punch you in the face and then super. I believe this has been fixed because it was really annoying to Boxer players, because you know this is worse than being parried. It's like, okay, so I just need to punch you twice more, but you're just gonna let me punch you and then super me. I don't know how, what am I supposed to do here? This is not even fair. Is character select on this week? So you are getting to see a bit more. You might not have noticed it before because the player was playing the character you see on the screen, so it's fine.
Let's do this.
So of course the question comes down, what can you do about it? What can you do to get better at fighting at this level? The short answer is nothing, other than to keep doing it. Like most things of this level of gaming, you practice it because it's in some way fun, or if it isn't fun, you probably have some other impetus for doing it for as long as you do. But one of the main things to work on, if you want to be able to at least somewhat enjoy it, is to respect it. And part of the reason why it's difficult in certain cases to respect it is because if you as a player don't know how to do it or don't realize that you're doing it, it's hard to see the skill in an opponent that is doing it. They're intending to frustrate you, and sometimes you leapfrog over the feeling that the frustration isn't just some random interaction. The frustration is a matter of your opponent applying a skill that overwhelms one of your shortcomings, which is of course frustrating, but you don't have to build up any respect for it innately if you don't understand that it's happening over and over, or if you end up somehow feeling it's unfair for them to be able to do it. And this can actually be more frustrating than a lot of characters who just basically have quote-unquote endless pressure, because those things have specific options. If you feel as if your opponent is literally going to keep on hitting medium strings forever, you can eventually be reversible. You can sometimes parry. You can uppercut out. The feeling of someone who you can't hit and who messes you up every time you try has no such solutions. You consistently take actions, they counter all of your actions, and there's nothing left. There's no feeling you can take to this of, well, I should be able to do X. Because if you have a 16 frame dash, and this is one of the hardest things to react to, games are generally timed such that dashes are borderline reactable, but usually not. You have to be primed to react to most dashes. You have to be at the point where you think the opponent is going to dash. Some people, obviously, can go a little bit beyond regular human and check a dash that isn't like that, but if you think carefully about it, the fact that the move has to start up on your side means that most people can at least dash up and block. The only reason they get hit is because they dash and try to do something, and the something is meaningfully slower than your dash check button. For Necalli, this is actually a little bit difficult for that reason. He doesn't have a lot of spacings that he gets to bully G in, for example. And a lot of the time blocking for long periods isn't going to lead to anything because G can walk up to Necalli into cross-up position more easily than nearly any other character.
G wins.
And G has options beyond just jumping. It's basically G and Mika, and they can just walk right up to Necalli, and Necalli doesn't really get to do anything about this. They can also dash, or use even specials to get past the Seismo, meaning, okay, now what? And also because they have good forward hitboxes on certain punches, they can beat the neutral jump as well. One of Necalli's strongest options against this is to just light kick a lot. Now it won't win every time, but it's definitely a strong enough option that it makes G care. And if G has to care, then G can be crouch medium kicked as well. Because if you want to look for a space in G's stuff and you want to hit with any button other than light kick, you are in for a long wait. For Necalli specifically, other characters can go, okay, I'm going to convert on this instant jump, dive kick, special thing, or back dash and wait for you to swing a button in my face and punish with my really long button. Necalli has nearly none of these options. Once he back dashes, he has lost the ability to use Disc Guidance.
Round 2.
The big swinging heavy claw punch does not actually reach most of the time. Stand heavy kick, awesome move, doesn't always work. In certain matchups actually sweep works out well, and I think this is one of the things we mentioned in this matchup a lot. It's not the greatest idea to use against a player like this one, though. It's more for someone who thinks they can get in and has to be... You have to constantly be on guard for their position. But it's not completely useless. But we've definitely mentioned on a stream before that footsies between Necalli and G often relies on Necalli hitting sweep, which is worked out by the fact that Necalli has one of the least punishable sweeps in the game. A good idea.
G wins.
When you've been brought down to hit light kick here, medium kick here, jump at this point, and maybe sweep, it's not that the matchup is complicated, it's that the matchup is difficult. And while you are adapting to all of those ranges, your opponent is adapting to you doing them to the point where they will just walk out of the range of certain things instead of standing there and going for more pressure. which is almost miserable. Abigail has similar options. One that doesn't come up often is the ability to just go into run, but instead of going for a punch or an avalanche or anything, to just parry. But this again is one of those things where you go, this is a terrible idea. What if my opponent hits nothing? Fortunately, they've decided to keep playing G, which is a matchup that is not going to go as well as it normally does, as again, this player's offense concept is extremely strong. But there are definitely more advantages to Abigail's tools here. The stand heavy kick is a much stronger tool. It's easier to parry out of G strings in a lot of cases, and easier to use V reversal in a lot of cases. The main thing you have to watch out for with a player of this caliber is that they're going to set up for low chains and command grabs. But that means you get a backdash, so you're back to having 5 things to do. They're going to be very hard to do, but at least it's not too complicated. But as we mentioned before, you should probably be watching for more jumps now, because we've seen one jump that got parried. And again, when someone is thinking like this, the next thing that happens is that they jump in a way that can't be parried. However, Mar is somewhat used to that and knows that, well, even if my instinct is to always counter this thing you're doing, sometimes I can parry, and sometimes I have to armor, and eventually we'll get one of them right. This is one of those situations where it's just, okay, I need to rack up XP now, because having not fought AG that uses these particular skills or doesn't, or know this particular level of the matchup, means that now you have to learn this level of the matchup. You have to evolve to keep up with them. But most of us can't do that in just one match or one set of matches. What we end up gaining is simply the knowledge that it's a thing that happens. If we want to win the match, we end up with using particular skills that we've got. If we want to learn new things, there's a different set of stuff that happens. Combining the two is, again, stressful. There's too much thinking to be done at that point. Because, as you've just seen, knowing that the G player is willing to go for the empty jump low means that it becomes harder to react when they don't. So neutral jump heavy punch now is stronger because of that. Neutral jump command grab is stronger only and entirely because of that crouching light kick. The more layers of offense a person has, the harder you have to work to deal with any given thing that happens, even if all of them are theoretically counterable and reactable. And honestly, people in game design these days spend a lot of time like perfecting very tuned things. Some people find this bad, some people find it great, some people find it limiting in terms of creativity. Like, they have this idea of what the game is supposed to be like, and you're allowed to play this way, and you get better at this. But you still get to choose your own paths a lot of the time. But even here, we see it coming up. That original strong intent from the moment of seeing that happen to go for, okay, now in order to get past this point, I need full power G burst. I can't deal with Abigail after everything I've just done without the full power G burst, so my priority is to get that. the mindfulness level of this particular player is very high. Because a lot of this would seem as if something you do to autopilot through a situation, but the number of situations you would need to know in order to autopilot at that level is not necessarily insane, but definitely beyond most casual play. Maybe now that we've had this game for like 5 years, you would find more people with that specific set of skills. But you can definitely tell when someone has really strong offense, because you could have an entirely clear idea of how to play a matchup in your head, and they make you forget parts. They work your brain so hard that you literally forget how to play the matchup while you are playing it.
I'll fight this battle. Why? Because it is.
In fact, that's slightly my expectation here. Not necessarily because it's super easy to remember this or hard to remember this in the first place, but simply because there are just so many layers. This is why so many people end up specializing in certain forms of defense. Because if you can let go mentally of the idea that you can avoid getting hit, and just sometimes take a certain hit, just pick one. Pick a thing to get hit by constantly, and hope your opponent doesn't do it too often. This can be effective, and is particularly effective at higher levels actually. Because at high levels, people are always wondering whether or not you're finally going to win out on the adaptation, whether or not you're really committing to letting them jump in on you every time. But if you've chosen a place you're going to falter, you don't have to choose the same one every round.
Round 2.
You don't have to choose the same one every interaction. You could just decide beforehand, if my opponent dashes up to me, I'm just gonna let him dash, because I'm not in the mood for checking their dash. I don't think I could. Or just the idea that checking their dash means you won't anti-air, you won't block the overhead, you won't pay attention to meter. You'll say, nah, I need those things, I'm gonna let you dash. And sometimes your opponent will catch on to this and dash at you and defeat you by dash throwing you 6 times in one round. But it's not specifically that the match would have turned out that different. Technically, it might have been more or less frustrating based on what you expected of yourself and what you expected of them.
Not my day.
You win.
So we see a push forward. And now, we will probably get to see just how many layers of offense there are, at least for their G. Because there are definitely layers of offense that were not used, that can be used. Little delay movement things. Some instant jump, well not instant, but some jump stuff. Some perfectly spaced wheel kick stuff. They're in there. They're options that still... There you go, there's one. And that one has a fairly big payoff. Crouch medium kick is now in. Dash up command grab is a little bit harder. You gotta work a little hard to get that one in there. Mainly because it's actually lower on the totem pole for most other players, meaning that other people would have been trained to stop it, so you have to put on more and more layers in order to get it back as an option for serious damage.
Round 2. Fight.
But we can definitely at least somewhat count on the jumping down medium, the spacing on the G burst, and of course the classic neutral jump kick against carrying Kansi. because being in the air is also a form of being out of reach of your opponent's next attack.
You lose.
In Karin's case, particularly strong one. So, you get a rare look at, rare-ish. We get these like once or twice a month where someone will come in and play at near max level relative to what the team could deal with. There are people who are just so overwhelming that their max level is just complete destruction, and sometimes you see that within these matches, but even those times it's more so a string of incorrect choices. This is more so a, I can actually dominate the entire thing by pushing your mind to its limit, by making you unable to punish certain things because you're too strained to punish them, and so on. And it's good to get this experience every now and again. Sadly, it's not very clear often where you're going to get it, and a lot of the time you feel as if you must rank up in order to try. Probably. We no longer make judgments on whether or not that's required. The game is too old now to be sure with any given player.
You lose.
But we are at about the end of our stream, despite this being the sort of thing that we would keep up for a long time. Still, that means not as much as it normally does, because we did start this stream late, so we're not necessarily going to end it right away. We are definitely reaching the point where I'm mostly going to be repeating though, unless of course Gamer2256 changes character again. These types of skills don't necessarily apply to any character a person chooses to play. It is often more so that there is a specific subset of the cast that has the tools required for the person to show you their style. A character unable to do this would be a difficult one to push forward with. This style, for example, doesn't work out well with Kage. It would be that is exactly what I was expecting. Because it's again the same thing. A character that will get out of a certain space, is able to convert off certain things, and has a move that can basically cross the screen immediately. Urian's problem is that of the characters that play in this exact style that has been displayed by this player so far, Urian is the weakest because when he's close, his pressure ends too early. Even the headbutt stuff, because you don't always have to be able to, like, counter the headbutt stuff. You can reasonably comfortably let Urian get away with a certain number of things as long as you know when to tech, or you respond to things like headbutt with back jump, because he normally doesn't do anything to it. Specifically, Urian can usually hit 2 buttons and then you as the character get to hit light kick. This is a general rule of Urian. If you've blocked 2 of Urian's buttons, basically any 2 reasonable buttons, unless you saw him do like a light kick, which is really obvious, just hit your own, because chances are he doesn't get to do anything. He might go for something really gutsy, but then he has to worry about you blocking. Urian, of course, balances this on the other side. If you do make a mistake and Urian has Aegis ready, the conversion will kill you. It is at least on the same level of G, if not stronger, and is definitely more consistent. meaning that offense is not as heavily required because you can use your skills with the Aegis combos to make up for it in certain spaces. And because you can't really force Urien to be reversal that much, it kinda helps. The character does unfortunately not get a whole lot of crush counters in most play, and therefore can be overwhelmed close to the end of the health bar. Fortunately, for Urien, Aegis is also invincible and functions as a reversal in those situations, and he's usually capable of keeping you from doing any big damage without him having messed up or taken a risk. Meaning that the closer Urien gets to the trigger, the more throwable he is. And the reason he's more throwable is because he doesn't have as many crazy options he can use without worrying that you're going to block them and possibly completely defeat him before he gets much Aegis stuff done. The problem with this is that if your character doesn't have a fast enough dash or a good setup for the throw doesn't necessarily come into play much. You don't get to actually use it. But here we are, Aegis time. Are they gonna get the stun? Yes! It isn't obvious, but Urien pays for being able to do that by having poorer pressure in general. If you know how to avoid most of that, good, but that level of it was basically unavoidable. That's being too close to the corner, and the opponent being too good at your Aegis combos. Most of the time you just expect them to maybe drop it, and you'd scramble out, maybe, but Alice wouldn't scramble out that well anyway, so it's probably fine. If we see Urien again though, there are two levels of difficulty for our Gamer 2256. One is that despite not necessarily knowing all the flashy combos, Cosmic Wolf has played Urien. There's a certain amount of understanding of range and of how many things can be done before someone can do something about it. Because when you're on the playing side of that, it comes up fairly often. And the opposite side is simply that type of determination that Cosmic Wolf has. Urien is a character who doesn't get to keep doing a certain thing for free, as we just mentioned. Meaning that if you decide, I'm just going to keep doing this until you eventually try to do something else to get real pressure, if you can manage to hold yourself back and block a little longer at least some of the time, the player is forced to face certain options. Can I actually get you opened up at all? And if I try, are you going to hit that same button you've been hitting all of this time and crush counter me and kill me? Fortunately, for them, a bit at least, they have chosen the skill 2, which is actually kind of important in this matchup, as it creates a scenario where Nikali can no longer just go through Urien projectiles. It's not necessarily the best thing to spend a lot of your time on. As you can see here, it's probably better to just play full offense at least a bit. But having the option for those moments where your opponent decides to, for example, run away, is still helpful. If you get really good at reacting to people's backdashes, for example, you can actually manage to do this and still defend from Seismo. This comes up a lot in characters who have V skills that power them up in some way. Watching for your opponent's backdash or back jump moment to use that, or even when you just realize, oh, you walked backward, I'm fairly sure you're committing to that walk backward. I have a little time before you realize I'm doing this and actually do something else. From Nikali's side, the best way to get this in the way you want is to stomp. To stomp a lot. Because stomp changes a concept of this flow that Urien has little or no counter for. That one. And again, note, the closer Urien gets to being able to use Aegis, the more likely you are going to get throw. There's the Indignant Thunder. But now, this is harder, because now there is no more... Yep. That was kind of interesting, but I think I knew that wasn't going to happen.
Urian wins.
So that was a good play by Cosmic Wolf at the end, because, oh yes, you have Aegis now. You want to use this. There's still a moment of the mindset of looking for the Aegis moment. You can offset this by the Urian player by going ham, but again, it's still weighing on you in some way. You still put in some amount of effort in one direction or another. Here's a good example. The more Nakali stomps, the more reasonably likely it is that Urian has to take a risk. Because at the same space where you have a block string, Stomp stops most things Urian wants to do, other than tackle. But if you tackle, and your opponent didn't stomp and just blocked, now what? You can create these moments. And at that point, it's more so about your opponent stressing you out so much that you don't do them right, or that you don't think of them. This moment, for example, but this is also something that's relatively hard to do against Cosmic Wolf for very long. In other words, if I had to go, is this style of play likely to lead to a perfect? Because you've been playing all the rest of the ways, and now this player has decided, I'm going full offense, I'm going to frustrate you by pressure now. What are the chances that the perfect will happen? This is measurable by which team member is doing it, by which mindset they're in. Especially if the other player knows the mindset, because it isn't always that the perfect comes because they just go in the entire time. It's because they know when you are stressed enough to go for the invincible move if you have one. But if we assume that this is Urian again, because I wouldn't assume it was Urian again, mainly because again, Urian is technically the weakest at this, and Amara probably has shown a certain set of skills that would make doing it on the Urian side suspect. You wouldn't be sure enough that you could win it. Birdie is more sure, because it's again a lot of the same thing. Abigail has a lot of moves and a lot of things to stop people that don't work on Birdie correctly. Birdie can slide and not get hit by armored punches. Birdie can jump and not get hit by other things. Birdie can avoid certain moves altogether and throw down cans. It's generally at least somewhat frustrating. In fact, if anything, it makes more sense to use less moves and more just bullying normals on Abigail until Birdie is tired and then switching to her moves. But the result you can see here is, oh, I should probably do more actual stuff. But we've gone back to the original game plan. Birdie's good at whiff punishing. Eventually, the expectation is that Amara will hit something or get into some position, because never will they want to stand at a spot where Birdie actually gets hit. However, Birdie is one of the characters who is most susceptible to Abigail actually run forward parry, and therefore has to deal with all of the stuff that goes with having that as an option. In other words, if you have run forward parry when your opponent intends to twitch, and you don't expect to get into terrible trouble for doing it, then it means that your opponent has to try to not twitch. And if they have to try to not twitch, you get a run forward of nearly anything else you want. That moment there is usually where a setup happens. A player goes, okay, I have EX run at you twice and parried twice, and the expectation is that the defending player will go, you're going to do that again. I'm going to be ready this time. and then you don't. You punch them, or something else. I'm not expecting that from this side. I'm expecting this player to hit that point in their mind and then sort of randomize their next reaction. It's a decent bypass skill. Something has happened to you twice and you get that urge to beat it the next time it happens. If you're capable, mentally, randomize the thing you do next. You might go for it, you might not. Just let go and pick at the moment of whatever happens. And that was a result based on that, because in that moment, the birdie player doesn't know if Abigail is going to EX run at close range and parry on your wake up. Especially when you have so little health that the parry will kill you. So they are forced to randomize it, which means you get the dice roll. You can make a hard read a lot of the time, but now we are at banana and probably can. For the same reason. There needs to be more systems for controlling Amara's concepts and movement than there have been up until this point. Abigail does have some good options against this, but not a lot of ones that are easy to execute. Because can is not actually parryable under most circumstances. Neutral jumps don't really help a lot, although they're better than most things, particularly neutral jump medium punch. And instead, while most of what is layered on here is something really complicated, the fact that Abigail gets to hit buttons from far enough away, neutral jump medium punch, neutral jump heavy kick, those things mean that Birdie can't do the exact same thing with the can as with other characters. And this means Abigail gets to block the can. Everyone else, when you block the can, is like, okay, well, I know by the time I block this can, Birdie will be in range to go for a mix-up or something. Because that's the setup. But because doing that against Abigail has counters from the Abigail side, there's no way to be sure it will work or be a good idea. So the rest of us who have to suffer through, yeah, I'm just gonna throw a can at you and get stuff. Abigail doesn't have to do this. Ooh, that was one seriously interesting decision. As you can see, this gets fairly hyper. Birdie does not give up a massive number of tools in order to get this to work. He does have things he can do that don't actually have easy counters from Abigail's side. But not while playing the same thing we were just talking about. Playing this style doesn't usually leave you with a lot of options for those same Birdie style. So you're going to get a lot more scrambles, a lot more interactions like this, a lot more flinches, because Abigail can put on more pressure technically. Good armor though. And that would have been baited even if it wasn't reversal. But the spacing did not quite work out.
Abigail wins.
So that one was very close. And technically, we're pretty sure we're not going to rotate back around to see that player play again before we end the stream. So, thank you for your contribution, Gamer2256. And, as you'd expect, they've headed on out. As for us, it's now around the time where we would normally end the stream, so we'll probably have this as the last on-stream set of the night. And then move into all the other things we intend to do. We're super busy lately with multiple other projects, not necessarily fighting game related. But you're still only going to see our fighting game related projects for the most part. Team members do occasionally stream their own stuff on their own channels. You can look around for 2MK channels. But mostly it'll just be more Street Fighter. We've been taking to streaming bot practice more often. Just so people can see what it is that they actually function like for us, rather than just watching it as guidance, because sometimes we have slight variance or the bots input in a variable enough way. Time for some display of some round trip netcode. I'm sure there's a good reason why round trip netcode does this. It happens in most games actually. But it's not necessarily going to help today. Still, it's not at the unplayable level, and these players know each other reasonably well, so you should still get a good match out of it. You're most likely going to get the 2 or 3 frame rollback on particular confirms. That makes the game look stuttery, but there's a decent chance that people will mostly be on screen where they're supposed to be, when they're supposed to be, at least toward the ending of things. And fortunately, this game has relatively quote-unquote tuned block stun.
You lose.
The important thing there being that if you're used to blocking a move, waiting exactly this fraction of a second to hit the counter, it'll still manage.
Round 1. Fight.
Though I do end up wondering whether or not the signal thinks it needs to go around the tri-state area. We'll happily one of these days have everyone gather together and have a Mish-Mashing exhibition that is just versus mode. But then you wouldn't get other people's participation. Still, if we all happened to be around the same place for the same reason, it might be worth it. Mostly of those, of course, though, this happens at tournaments, and at tournaments we're again fighting other people, usually in large amounts. And with a flick of the finger, we have come to the end of our stream. The lounge will probably stay open at least somewhat longer. We're not expecting a lot of joiners today. If you do want to join still, it is 3 rounds first to 2 with character select on today. You can join us on Thursday for our Dead or Alive 60 times lounge content, and next Monday for another Mish-Mashing Battle Lounge. And I think this weekend I'm going to at least see if I release LaraBot 1.4, because I keep on forgetting to actually do this, and I've forgotten how effective LaraBot 1.4 is, despite it being really difficult to input. So, this has been Rillian for Team 2MK. Good luck with your training and good night everyone.